It felt the egg shift in soft mud at the pond edge. The shell was warm and trembled as wind moved the reeds. It heard small cracks along the shell as pressure and heat changed inside. It pushed hard once more, and the shell split open. The hatchling slipped out wet and shivering with a soft shell, still glossy and flexible. A larger Squirtle stayed close and pressed a curved tail against the nest. The tail blocked. The hatchling felt its shell was soft and its body still compact. It could not dive deep or swim fast yet. Shallow swimming in quick bursts let it feed on algae, but those moves left it exposed. It saw a Pidgeotto circling over the reed bed and watching for movement. The hatchling understood it could not rely on speed or deep cover. It had to stay close to its mother to survive. The hatchling felt the pressure rise fast. A float cell slid through the nearshore water. Its sudden wide wake tore through the shallow plants. The current shifted where it passed. It pulled at the small limbs of the hatchling and scattered the thin algae mats they fed on. The hatchling heard a Pidgeotto call above and saw it angle closer. The approach of the float cell pushed hatchlings out of their tiny hollows into open shallows. The hatchling knew one mistake could mean being taken. She moved slowly into the reed clump and nudged the hatchlings one by one. She put her body between them and the open water to block the wind and waves and turned them toward thicker stems. She watched them push in short, match strokes, paddle a little, tuck, and slip sideways into the reeds. The roots held the mud and the water around them calmed enough for the group to settle. She guided the young into a deep patch of reeds where the stems grew close and the mud was soft enough to let them bury part of their bodies. She watched the hatchlings press low and push their shells into the mud. They used quick, short pushes to shuffle along the base of the reeds. She knew staying tight to the cover cut time in open water and made it harder for birds or fast swimmers to reach them. She saw the solution work for now. The floatzel skimmed along the reed edge with its nose in the water, but it could not reach the hatchlings pressed low in the stems. The Pidgeotto circled higher and then moved on when it found no clear target. One hatchling that had nearly been swept free felt the mud hold and wriggled back beside her. She understood they were safe for the moment and could feed in short, protected bursts. The hatchling knew safety here was temporary. It knew tides, storms, and seasonal floods could change the currents and the reed cover with little warning. It rested, breathing fast, watching the water move through the reeds while its mother kept a careful posture. It knew a harder shell and stronger limbs would take time to grow. For now, survival meant staying close to shelter, moving quickly together with its mother, and keeping constant watch for the next change in the pond. Squirtle moved from the shallow nest toward a line of rocks and reeds. He watched the other juveniles use longer strokes as they tested the new water. A dark shape moved across the sun, and he saw the group draw closer together. His heart beat faster. He paused in the water and did not know whether one juvenile left the nest with the others to feed on exposed rocks and in shallow channels. It found richer bites there, but the swims were longer and its endurance was limited. It could not rely on its shell for long dives. From the water, it watched a Firo hunting over open water. Firo made fast passes that forced quick decisions. Each rush from above scattered the group and reduced their feeding time. As afternoon moved toward dusk, the juvenile heard the wing beats change and watched a new threat arrive. A golbat. It hunted low and silent, flapping into shadows and making sudden drops. The juvenile pushed into clearer channels to dodge the swoops. Feeding became irregular and inefficient. It spent more time fleeing than biting. He saw the reed tangles bend the light and slow the water at the surface. The stems opened narrow lanes and pockets of calmer water. That thin edge changed the choices before the group. He felt the shift in his head. A new plan formed. Move sideways, not straight. He adapted quickly. He began making short, deeper bursts into the reed edges instead of long sprints across open rock. He moved sideways along the stems to make staggered targets. When a wing or a shadow came close, he flipped into a tight shell turn and pivoted his body to use his beak or bite. He saw that the moves matched the habitat and that he could repeat them. Firo watched the pattern continue. When it came back, it could not find a single easy target. One juvenile folded into the reeds and hid. Another turned its shell and forced a miss. Bites hit the group again, and feeding went on longer between. They expected Golbat to return at night, and they knew the water level could change with weather or wind. The new tactic worked for now, but the shoreline did not stay the same. They watched the juveniles move in a steady rhythm. They wondered if the next tide would be the real test. The channel narrowed between reeds and stone, and the current quickened. Wartortle felt the pull on his limbs with every stroke. He saw the deeper blue where the water left the shallow edge. His shell showed new ridges, not full armor yet, but thicker than before. Food lay past the faster water. He knew he had to move now, or he would miss the feeding rocks. Wartortle knew the deeper channel meant longer swims and longer dives. His body was still learning that work. He could not hold his breath as long as an adult. Early calcification of his shell added weight and made each stroke use more energy. The gap between the shore and the food left him in open water and exposed. Each extra second under pressure raised his risk of exhaustion. Wartortle moved along the submerged ledges covered in algae. He saw a kingler patrolling the rocks and snapping at anything that touched them. He pushed toward a feeding shelf, and the crab lunged, pincers opening through the current. He had to divide his effort between holding position and dodging hard, sudden strikes. The surge of water and the reach of the crab forced him into wider arcs and wasted his breath. Wartortle found a narrow seam behind a sunken slab, an eddy that softened the flow. He felt his tail bend harder. His new shell plates shifted under his skin and made a small solid sound when he pressed into the rock. The pause in the current was brief, but it let him rest for a single stroke and watch the pattern of the water. Wartortle changed how he moved. He timed short, powerful pushes into the eddy and kept his shell low to cut drag. He held his breath, dove deeper through the fast band, and used tail sweeps to steer around the kingler's line. When the current eased, he pushed forward in synchronized bursts, then slid into cover to breathe. His thicker shell and stronger limbs made those bursts longer than before. It worked. Wartortle reached the algae shelf and scraped food from the rock before the kingler could close its claw again. His chest ached and his tail trembled. He surfaced with more breath left than a week ago. The shell had a small chip where a claw had glanced off. He understood the new plates could take blunt hits. For now, the deeper channel was passable. Wartortle watched the river and understood the season would push the water harder in the nights ahead. He saw a distant shape moving on the bank. The shape breathed hot air and walked in long strides. An arcanine patrolled the shoreline and left prints in the mud. Wartortle tucked into the next eddy, watching the flow and the land at once. He knew every change in the water would test his growing strength. The tide turned and the channel narrowed. Wartortle felt the water pull at its shell and tail. Shadows between the rocks grew shorter as water rushed through the boulders. Wartortle knew this part of the shoreline had sudden surges. The crevices would now hold it for less time. Wartortle sees larger aquatic hunters patrolling the channels. It watches a ferroligata move low along the boulder line. The ferroligata forces water into narrow seams. Wartortle feels the currents push water into its hiding spots. The shelter windows shrink. It cannot stay hidden as long. Wartortle knows the ferroligata has big jaws and speed that make every exit from cover dangerous. Wartortle felt the current shift again, stronger and colder. He watched ferroligata lunge into the channel with a single strong strike. Wartortle tried to brace, but a side surge hit him and knocked him backward. Water slammed his shell against stone. For a moment, he saw the back slope of the crevice open, leaving his soft flank and head exposed to teeth and impact. Wartortle noticed a pattern in the water. The surge came in beats, not one steady push. It felt eddies where the water slowed between two boulders. A narrow seam left just enough room to wedge its rounded shell. The small space gave it a new option. It understood it could hold tight instead of fleeing. Wartortle turned its shell outward and drove its tail hard, each sweep a short, controlled shove against the current. It backed into the seam and pressed its shoulder plate into the stone, feeling the rock hold against its shell. The tail held its body in place. When Feraligatr reached in, Wartortle met the bite with the shell edge and a quick outward ram. It knew these moves traded speed for leverage and cover. Wartortle heard the predator snap and felt it slide along his shell, but it could not pry him free. He moved his tail with each surge, changing the angle of every sweep, and the wedge held. Small scrapes marked the shell, but his hold stayed firm. For now, the crevice kept out both the current and the predator. The channel is quiet for now, but Wartortle expects tides and hunters to push again. He eases out to test nearby gaps and to map the next shelter. He watches rocks, currents, and rival predators redraw safe spaces along the shore. He knows survival must repeat and change with every tide. The young Wartortle felt its body grow heavier with each step across wet rock and sand. The shell plates were thickening at the edges, and small knots of bone showed under the skin. Moving on land was slower now. A line of boulders it used to reach in a single burst of speed lay farther away. The tide pulled at its feet. It understood one clear thing. Speed was leaving, and shelter would be harder to find. It feels the heavier shell and the added weight on its back, and it moves slower on rock and sand. Quick, short sprints are no longer possible. That matters because safe crevices and boulder shelters are few along the shore. Other animals take advantage of any delay. If it cannot reach cover fast, the tide will rise, or larger competitors will move in. The trade-off between armor and speed shows in every step it takes. A Tyranitar appeared on the ridge. Its heavy steps shook small stones. The Wartortle watched it push a line of loose cobbles and saw sand and pebbles shift downhill. The Tyranitar checked between rocks for shelter. Each stomp loosened sand and rock. Small gaps collapsed and hiding places got smaller. The Wartortle saw the shadow grow and felt the shore change under its feet. Space for shelter was disappearing just when the Wartortle needed more room. When Tyranitar moved, Wartortle noticed small advantages in its new body. The rear shell plates locked into a firmer curve against its back. Two short jets at its shoulders forced water when it breathed out hard. It could not run, but it could brace and push. A narrow gap opened where a boulder had shifted tight enough that Tyranitar could not follow easily. Wartortle realized this was the first clear chance to use weight instead of speed. The Wartortle wedged its broader shell under the boulder lip and pressed down to hold itself. It angled the shell toward the threat and fired short, strong bursts of water into the shallow surf. The blast pushed loose sand and smaller competitors back. They created a shallow flow that kept the tide from lifting the shell from below. It used its extra weight to hold position and its water bursts to clear the space around the shelter. Wartortle watched the Tyranitar test the wedge and then turn away, unwilling to pry at the heavy, braced form. Wartortle's water pulses drove back smaller rivals that tried to slip into the gap. It felt its breathing slow and its limbs settle into the effort. It realized its thicker plates gave it an advantage now. It could hold a shelter on the shoreline it could no longer reach by speed, and the water blasts let it hold the site for the moment. The immediate danger had passed, but the shore kept changing. The tide would rise higher by afternoon, and armoured rivals like Agron were known to patrol the headlands. Wartortle understood that staying in the kelp mass would keep it safer for a time, and that its growing water power would open feeding zones in deeper kelp. It settled deeper into the wedge and watched the moving line where sea met stone, ready for the next pressure on its new body. The shoreline widened into open water, where the kelp began to thin. Blastoise felt the change as a long pulse through the surf. Far offshore, a Gyarados rose and rolled its massive body toward the kelp line. Blastoise felt his breathing tighten. He knew the kelp beds were both food and shelter. Now, a larger presence was cutting at the edges of that zone. Blastoise knew open water predators were the main danger. He watched them at the edge of the kelp and listened to their movement in the water. A long chase could force him out of the kelp and into exposed water. He felt direct collisions against his shell and limbs. Each impact tested how long he could keep pushing and hold his ground. He understood the real threat was not just the first hit, but the repeated force over time. Blastoise watched the Gyarados. It did not simply pass. It thrashed the surface and drew attention. Waves grew uneven. Fish scattered, and the kelp came loose from the rock. Blastoise felt the change in the current and heard the water slap. A Kingdra appeared as a fast shadow at the edge of the kelp bed. It darted along the edge, stirring small prey and drawing defenders away. Blastoise understood the pattern. The two behaviors combined into long pursuit from offshore and quick strikes from inside the kelp. That meant Blastoise faced both slow wear and sudden stinging blows. Blastoise felt the current shift and used the opening. He felt a deeper channel under a thick kelp pocket. The wave pattern slowed there. For a moment, the water gave him a place to brace. He turned his shell into the surge and planted his feet on a rocky shelf where his weight mattered most. Blastoise wedged himself into the channel and used mass and steady power. He let his bulk take the role of Gyarados. When the larger predator struck, he met it with steady water blasts meant to break its momentum. He timed long pushes instead of quick bursts. The pushes broke the rhythm of the fast runs of Kingdra and pushed Gyarados back from the most valuable kelp. He kept his focus on the kelp and held his blast steady. For now, it worked. The kelp held where he had braced it. He watched the Gyarados roll away in a long circle, avoiding the constant pressure. He saw the Kingdra pull to the fringe and hunt smaller pockets. He felt scrapes on his shell, and a water jet left a long bruise on his limb. But he kept the feeding ground and the kelp that sheltered juveniles. Blastoise watched the ocean and felt it change. Farther out, the currents tightened. A deeper swell moved toward the shore. The kelp line shifted again under the new force. Blastoise moved with it, heavier and slower, ready to use endurance and weight when the next strong wave tested the hold.